Just before noon on the 27th of August, 1979, a small wooden boat called Shadow V puttered out of Mullaghmore harbour on the northwest coast of Ireland. At the wheel, dressed like a scruffy pensioner on his holidays, sat one of the most decorated men in Britain. Admiral of the fleet, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, cousin to the Queen, uncle to Prince Philip, honorary grandfather to the future King Charles, and the last Viceroy of India. On board with him were his daughter, his son-in-law, an elderly dowager, twin grandsons of 14, and a local boy of 15 earning his holiday money. Minutes later, 50 pounds of explosive, hidden below the deck, blew the boat to splinters. He was probably the most warned man in these islands. The threats had been arriving for years. And every August, there he was, the same castle, the same harbour, his little boat sitting on a public mooring, unguarded all night. Whenever anybody raised the danger with him, he'd wave it away. He used to say, "What would they want with an old man like me?" Well, the men who built the bomb answered that question in writing. They didn't call it a murder, they called it an execution, and they explained quite precisely why they had chosen him. That same afternoon, 18 British soldiers died in a double ambush at Warren Point, the Army's worst single loss of the entire Troubles. In public, the palace spoke of grief and dignity. Behind closed doors, the conversations were about something else entirely. Ignored warnings, a security file that stayed shut for decades, a furious new prime minister, and a dead man who had spent 60 years playing politics harder than any royal was ever supposed to. Dicky arranged marriages, rewrote the family name, and lobbied ministers quite shamelessly. In 1968, he was even sounded out about fronting a coup against the British government. He said no, though he did let them finish the pitch. He spent years planning his own funeral, down to the last sailor in the seating in the Abbey, kept revising it the way other men revise a will. Friends joked it was the one show Dicky would genuinely mind missing. So who decided that Louis Mountbatten had to die, and why that particular summer? And what did London and Dublin know before Shadow Fee ever left her mooring? This is the story of a death the family called a tragedy, two governments called a crisis, and the men who planned it called politics. The killing of Lord Mountbatten was a political act from beginning to end. The palace simply preferred that nobody ever said so out loud. The story of why begins 62 years before the bomb, with a family changing its name in a hurry. He was born at Windsor Castle in the summer of 1900, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, and christened His Serene Highness, Prince Louis of Battenberg. The Battenbergs were minor German royalty who had married into the British family and done rather well out of the arrangement. His father, also Prince Louis, had risen to First Sea Lord, the professional head of the entire Royal Navy. Then the First World War broke out, and a German name in a British uniform became a serious liability. Within months of the war starting, his father was hounded out of office. The papers went for him, the public went for him, and the fact that he'd given his whole life to the British Navy counted for nothing. His 14-year-old son, a naval cadet at the time, watched it happen. Dicky said afterwards that he stood there as a boy and vowed he would one day hold his father's job himself. It's a touching story. It is also the story of a man who began plotting his career before he had started shaving. In 1917, King George V scrubbed the family tree of anything Germanic. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha became Windsor. Battenberg became Mountbatten. The boy who had been a Serene Highness was now plain Lord Louis Mountbatten, and he spent the next 6 decades making sure nobody ever mistook him for plain anything. In 1922, he married Edwina Ashley, granddaughter of the financier Sir Ernest Cassell and one of the richest young women in England. The Prince of Wales was best man. The couple honeymooned across America and finished in Hollywood, where they befriended Charlie Chaplin, who wrote and directed a short comedy film starring the newlyweds as a wedding gift. Most honeymooners come home with photographs. Dicky came home with a motion picture, directed by the most famous man on earth, starring himself. You could argue the rest of his life was an attempt to keep that arrangement going. The marriage that followed was glamorous, turbulent, and unconventional by any standard. Both took lovers more or less openly and stayed devoted to each other anyway. Mountbatten is reported to have said that he and Edwina's spent their whole married life getting into other people's beds, a line he apparently delivered without much embarrassment. They were the golden couple of the 20s. The penthouse on Park Lane, the parties, the polo. He even wrote a book about polo, but he published it under a pseudonym, Marco, presumably out of modesty. It sold rather well, and the secret of the author's identity survived roughly as long as Dickey could bear it to. He was a gadget man, an enthusiast, a fixer of systems. He specialized in naval signals, championed new technology, introduced zip fastenings to naval trousers, and during the war painted his ships in a mauve-gray camouflage shade of his own devising, known forever after as Mountbatten Pink. He was convinced it made vessels invisible at dawn and dusk. The Admiralty was never persuaded, and the color died with his command. He continued to recommend it for years. He could trace his descent from Charlemagne, and on quiet evenings he would. He kept genealogical tables proving he was related to practically every throne in Europe. Vanity isn't quite the right word. It was more like a hobby that had eaten its owner. Then came the war, and with it both the bravest and the most contested chapters of his life. In 1939, he took command of the destroyer HMS Kelly, and over the next 2 years drove her through a catalogue of near disasters with a flair the Navy found either inspiring or alarming depending on rank. In May 1941, off Crete, German dive bombers finally sank her. More than half the crew died. Mountbatten went into the oil-covered water with his men and was lucky to come out of it. Within a year, his friend Noel Coward had turned the sinking into a patriotic feature film, In Which We Serve, with Coward himself playing a captain modeled openly and lovingly on Dickey. Other officers survive a sinking. Mountbatten got a film premiere out of his. He adored it, screened it for guests, quoted it. There were men in the Navy who felt that losing a ship should perhaps be slightly worse box office. Churchill liked his dash and promoted him over the heads of a great many senior officers to run combined operations, the raiding arm of the war effort, with honorary rank in all 3 services at once. The appointment delighted Mountbatten and almost nobody else. Under his watch came genuine triumphs, including the St. Nazaire raid, in which an old destroyer packed with explosives was rammed into the gates of a German dry dock, and under his watch came Dieppe. On the 19th of August 1942, around 6,000 men, most of them Canadian, were thrown against a fortified French port in daylight. The operation collapsed within hours. Around 900 Canadians were killed and thousands more wounded or marched into captivity. It was a catastrophe by every measure, and questions about who revived the cancelled plan, and on whose authority, have followed Mountbatten ever since. He spent the rest of his life insisting that the lessons of Dieppe saved 10 men on D-Day for every man lost on that beach. It's a tidy formula. The men who study the documents tend to notice how often the documents seem to have been tidied too. He had a gift, and I say this with a certain dark admiration, for arriving at the scene of a disaster and leaving with a promotion. Dieppe would have ended most careers. His continued upwards as though the beach had never happened. Continue upwards it did. In 1943, aged only 43, he was made Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, running the war against Japan in Burma. Wags in the service said the command's initials stood for Supreme Zampion of Allied Confusion, but the campaign turned. The 14th Army fought its way back through Burma, and in September 1945, Mountbatten stood in Singapore and accepted the surrender of 750,000 Japanese troops. He was photographed at the center of history, which was the only place he had ever wanted to stand. The Army's verdict on his methods was delivered some years later by Field Marshal Gerald Templer to his face, in a single sentence. Templer told him he was so devious that if he swallowed a nail, he would produce a corkscrew. The truly remarkable thing is that Dickey repeated that line at dinner parties for the rest of his life. He thought it was a compliment. In a way, for the career he had in mind it was. Because by then he had already pulled off the longest and most consequential maneuver of that career, and it had nothing to do with ships. In July 1939, when the royal family visited the Naval College at Dartmouth, Mountbatten arranged for an 18-year-old cadet to look after the visiting party. The cadet was Prince Philip of Greece. his own nephew, a Battenberg by blood. Among the visitors was a 13-year-old princess named Elizabeth, who by all accounts never looked at another man again. Other courtiers attended the royal family. Dickey restocked it. He steered Philip toward the future queen with the patience of a man laying down a 40-year investment, and in November 1947 in Westminster Abbey, the investment matured. It matured. And then he overplayed his hand. Within days of King George VI's death in 1952, Mountbatten was heard boasting at a house party that the House of Mountbatten now reigned in Britain, since the new queen's husband married his name. The remark traveled at speed. Queen Mary, the new queen's grandmother, was incandescent. She had lived through the agony of changing the family name once and had no intention of watching a Battenberg rename the firm over her dead body. Churchill's cabinet formally advised the young queen that her house and family would remain Windsor. The instruction went out from Downing Street within the week. Windsor it stayed. Dickey had been told no by a queen mother, a prime minister, and the entire cabinet, which for most men would settle the matter. He waited 8 years. In 1960, a compromise was announced, giving certain descendants the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. He had hyphenated himself into the bloodline of the British monarchy by sheer persistence. The man footnoted his way into history, and he was prouder of that hyphen than of most of his medals: soldier, matchmaker, name lobbyist, film subject. All of it before the job that would follow him to the bottom of an Irish bay. In March 1947, Mountbatten flew into Delhi as the last Viceroy of India, sent by the Attlee government to wind up British rule over 400 million people. London gave him until June of the following year. He looked at the communal violence already burning through Punjab and Bengal, consulted his own lifelong instinct for momentum, and announced that independence would instead arrive on the 15th of August, 1947, barely 5 months away. He is said to have picked the date partly because it was the anniversary of the Japanese surrender, which is to say, partly because it was an anniversary of his. The line dividing India from the new state of Pakistan was drawn by Cyril Radcliffe, a London barrister who had never been to India in his life, working from maps and out-of-date census records in about 5 weeks. The award was published 2 days after independence. Entire provinces learned which country they lived in from the radio, after the flags had already gone up. What followed was one of the great catastrophes of the century. Communities that had lived side by side for generations turned on each other along the new border. Estimates of the dead run from several 100,000 to 2 million, with around 1 million the figure most often cited, and some 14 million people were driven from their homes in the largest forced migration ever recorded. Historians still argue about how much of it belongs at Mountbatten's door, and the man himself never stopped arguing his corner either. His defenders say the house was already on fire and he got everyone he could to the exits. His critics say he was the man who decided the fire brigade should leave early, and then gave interviews about his splendid handling of the blaze. What nobody disputes is that he presided over it in the white uniform, with the medals in the photographs. There was glamour amid the horror, of a distinctly awkward kind. His wife Edwina formed a so famously close attachment to India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, a friendship of real depth conducted more or less in public while her husband governed the country and then stayed on as independent India's first Governor-General. The Mountbatten marriage was, let's say, broad-minded in both directions, and Dickey seems to have concluded that if his wife's bond with Nehru kept the negotiations warm, that was simply another instrument of diplomacy. It is not an approach they teach at the Foreign Office. When Edwina died in 1960 and was buried at sea, Nehru sent an Indian frigate to follow the coffin and cast marigolds on the water. Even the Mountbatten's love triangle had a state element. Churchill, by many accounts, took years to forgive him for what he regarded as the giving away of India, and for a long while would barely speak to him. In Britain, though, the verdict that stuck was the flattering one. The dashing viceroy who ended an empire on schedule and came home covered in honors. Here is the part that matters for our story. Across the Irish Sea, in Republican eyes, the same man read very differently. He was the living symbol of how an empire conducts itself on the way out the door. When the IRA later called him an imperialist figure, they were not reaching for an insult. The man had governed a fifth of the human race in a plumed hat. Back in London, he climbed exactly where he had promised his 14-year-old self he would climb. In 1955, he became First Sea Lord, the office his father had been hounded from 41 years earlier. He noted the symmetry to anyone within range. Then he went one better, becoming Chief of the Defense Staff, the professional head of all three armed services, a post he held longer than any man before or since, forcing through the creation of a unified Ministry of Defense and exhausting a procession of ministers in the process. The constitutional theory is that royalty stays out of politics. Dickey treated that theory as a suggestion, and a weak one. He lobbied prime ministers, briefed favored journalists, pushed appointments, and wrote memos nobody had requested on subjects nobody had raised. He was the best-connected man in Britain, and he never for one moment allowed anyone to forget it. Which brings us to the strangest afternoon of his life. In May 1968, at Mountbatten's London home, the press baron Cecil King, chairman of the Mirror newspaper group, laid out a proposition. The Labour government of Harold Wilson, King said, was finished. The country was sliding toward chaos. An emergency administration would be needed, fronted by a respected national figure whom the public would trust. The figure he had in mind was sitting opposite him, wearing, one imagines, an expression of carefully managed interest. Solly Zuckerman, the government's chief scientific advisor, was in the room. He stood up, said the whole thing was rank treachery, told Dickey to have nothing to do with it, and walked out. Mountbatten declined the offer, though it has been noted by everyone who has ever studied that meeting that the pitch was allowed to run its full course before he did. He told the story differently every time for the rest of his life, always with himself as the hero of the Constitution. But ask the obvious question. Why did men contemplating the replacement of an elected British government bring the idea to a member of the royal family at all? Because they knew which member might at least be flattered. That is a reputation you earn over decades. He retired from official duties in 1965 and settled into the role of the family's elder statesman, with a workload that suggested a man allergic to retirement. He fronted a 12-part television series about his own life and times, which he helped script and narrated himself, and which the rest of the royal family privately considered a touch vulgar. He considered it several episodes too short, and he planned his funeral. He had begun the file in the 1960s and updated it for the rest of his life. The route, the gun carriage, the marching contingents, the hymns, the congregation, the seating plan in Westminster Abbey, his charger Dolly walking behind the coffin, with his boots reversed in the stirrups. He went through the folder with house guests, genuinely cheerful about the whole thing, adjusting the order of march as contemporaries died off and created vacancies. Friends teased him that the arrangements had only one flaw, which was his own unavoidable absence on the day. To one young man, none of this looked like vanity. To Prince Charles, the old admiral was confidant, counselor, co-conspirator, and the warm center of an otherwise chilly family. Letters between them ran for years, signed from the honorary grandfather, and Mountbatten, alone among the people around the heir, told him the truth to his face. In the last year of his life, he wrote to Charles warning him, in brutal terms, that his behavior was taking him down the same slope of selfishness that had wrecked the life of his great-uncle, the abdicated Edward Vid. You can count on one hand the people who ever spoke to the Prince of Wales like that. And of course Dickey had a plan attached, because Dickey always had a plan attached. The plan was his granddaughter, Amanda. He had been steering her and Charles together for years, Dartmouth all over again, 40 years on. There was even a scheme for the three of them to tour India together in 1980. The wedding ring was meant to be his last great fix. Every plan needs a summer headquarters. His sat on a headland on the northwest coast of Ireland, Classybon Castle, County Sligo, a grey Victorian pile above the fishing village of Mullaghmore, built in the 19th century for Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, on an estate from which Palmerston's agents had once shipped famine tenants across the Atlantic. in some of the most notorious emigrant vessels of the age. The castle came down through Edwina's family to the Mountbattens, who began spending every August there in the 1950s. Even the holiday home, in other words, was imperial history in stone. You could not have designed a more loaded address if you'd tried. The last Viceroy of India, summering in Palmerston's castle on a famine landlord's old estate, in a county where the folk memory of all that runs very deep indeed. And here is the strange thing. The locals liked him, they genuinely did. The family had been coming for more than 20 years, and Mullaghmore had grown used to them. The castle employed local people. The children of the house played with the children of the village. Dickie pottered about the harbour in clothes that had surrendered years before, hauling lobster pots from a 30-foot wooden boat called Shadow V, looking less like an admiral of the fleet than a retired ferry skipper who had wandered off with someone else's hat. He was completely at ease there. He swam every morning, he fished, he knew people by name and they knew him. He used to say the people of Mullaghmore would never let anything happen to him, and as far as the village itself went, he was absolutely right. The threat did not live in the village. By the 1970s, the conflict across the border had hardened into one of the most disciplined guerrilla campaigns in Europe, and the Irish state had long since marked the castle down as a problem. When the family was in residence, a Garda protection detail was assigned, watching the house and escorting the cars. Mountbatten tolerated the arrangements the way he tolerated most advice given to him by other people. The paperwork existed. That's what the released files eventually showed. Threat assessments on Classibon going back to the early 70s, reviewed year after year. He even put his own position in writing, telling officials that elaborate protection was pointless, that anyone determined to kill him could do it easily, and anyway, what would they want with an old man like him? He had answered his own question without noticing, and the gap in the security never moved. The detail covered the castle and the roads. The boat was nobody's job. Shadow V sat on a public mooring in an open harbor, unguarded, every night of every August, where anyone could walk down the slip in the dark. Republicans later claimed an attempt the previous summer had been prepared and called off because of weather. Whether that is exactly true, the wider point isn't in dispute. He had been on a list for years, he knew it, and he kept coming. Part of it was an old sailor's fatalism. Part of it, stranger still, was a politics of his own. By several accounts, Mountbatten privately regarded eventual Irish unity as more or less inevitable, and said so to visitors in the relaxed manner of a man who had personally handed back the subcontinent, and saw no reason to be sentimental about anywhere smaller, which is the first great irony of this story. The symbol the IRA chose to execute may well have privately agreed with them about where history was heading. But symbols don't get a vote. That is rather the point of being one. By the summer of 1979, the context around the castle had turned lethal. In March, weeks before the general election, the INLA had murdered Harry Neve, war hero and the closest political ally of Margaret Thatcher, with a bomb under his car as he drove out of the House of Commons car park. In May, Thatcher entered Downing Street with Northern Ireland already burning a hole in her desk. The IRA, reorganized into small sealed cells that informers found almost impossible to penetrate, was looking for operations that would land on front pages around the world. An aging royal with a fixed routine, light security and a boat left overnight on a public slip offered exactly that, at almost no operational risk. The planners never needed to approach the castle. They needed one dark night and the harbor. They took the night of Sunday, the 26th of August. Under cover of darkness, a bomb of around 50 pounds of explosive was placed aboard Shadow V at her mooring and wired to a radio-controlled detonator. The man who planted it was Thomas McMahon, 31 years old, from County Monaghan, regarded as one of the IRA's most skilled bomb makers. What happened the next morning is among the strangest details in the whole case. At about 20 to 10 on Monday the 27th, nearly 2 hours before the explosion, McMahon and a second man, Francis McGurl, were stopped at a routine Garda checkpoint at Granard in County Longford, some 70 miles from Mullaghmore. The officer grew suspicious about the car, and both men were taken into custody. When the bomb destroyed Shadow V, Its maker was already sitting in a Garda station, which tells you the operation never depended on him. The device was in place, and the trigger was elsewhere. Somewhere on the headland above that harbor, other men were watching the boat with a transmitter in their hands. They have never been publicly identified. They have never been charged. It was a bank holiday Monday, clear and bright, and Mullaghmore was full of families. Shortly before 11:30, Shadow Fee left the harbor to check the lobster pots a few hundred yards out. 7 people were aboard. Mountbatten, 79, at the wheel. His daughter Patricia and her husband John, Lord Brabourne. John's mother Doreen, the Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83. The Brabournes' 14-year-old twin sons Nicholas and Timothy. And Paul Maxwell, 15, a schoolboy from Enniskillen working as boat boy for the holidays, a job he loved. People on the harbor wall were watching the little boat when the signals was sent. The explosion tore Shadow apart in an instant. Witnesses described a roar, a column of water and timber where the boat had been, and then wreckage and bodies in the sea. Local boats raced out within minutes. Fishermen and holidaymakers pulled the living and the dead from the water with their hands and carried the injured ashore on boat doors and whatever else would serve as a stretcher. Lord Mountbatten was killed. So was his grandson Nicholas. So was Paul Maxwell. Doreen, Lady Brabourne, died of her injuries the following morning. Patricia, John, and the surviving twin, Timothy, were brought ashore terribly wounded and spent weeks in hospital. Timothy learned of his twin brother's death from a hospital bed. Days afterwards, his parents too badly hurt to be told the whole of it themselves at first. There is no version of this paragraph with anything light in it, and there is not meant to be. 3 of the dead were a man of 79, a woman of 83, and 2 boys who between them had not reached 31 years of age. I have reported this island's worst days for a long time, and Mullaghmore stays with you because of the children, and because of the village. Local men lifted that family out of their own harbor. Some of them knew every single person on that boat by name. The day was not finished. That afternoon, across the border at Warren Point in County Down, an IRA unit detonated a bomb hidden in a hay lorry as an army convoy passed, killing 6 soldiers of the parachute regiment. The planners had studied how the army responded to attacks, and they had planned for the response. As reinforcements gathered at a nearby gate lodge, a second, larger device was detonated precisely where they stood. 12 more soldiers died, among them Lieutenant Colonel David Blair, the most senior British officer killed in the entire conflict. 18 dead in a single ambush. The Army's worst day of the Troubles, and the same date as the murder of a member of the royal family. That evening, the IRA issued its statement. It claimed what it called the execution of Lord Mountbatten, described the operation as one of the discriminate ways of bringing the reality of British occupation home to the English people, and set his death against years of Irish deaths that, it said, England had managed not to notice. Read that document carefully because it sits at the heart of this story: a named target, a stated rationale, an intended audience, and the audience was London, not Sligo. Whatever else you want to call what happened in that harbor, the men who did it put their political reasoning in writing before the sun went down. And in the days afterwards, you saw the ugliest confirmation of how it was being scored. A slogan went up on walls in some Republican areas pairing the day's arithmetic with the 13 dead of Bloody Sunday 7 years earlier. 18 soldiers and Mountbatten, weighed against 13 of theirs. It turns the stomach. It is also, unmistakably, the language of a ledger, and ledgers are political documents. In London, the official response moved on 2 entirely separate tracks, and the distance between them is the distance this film is about. The public track was grief, managed with the family's usual discipline. The palace spoke of profound shock. Flags came down across the country. Tributes arrived from presidents, kings, and parliaments. The language from the institution itself was the language of tragedy, of senseless violence, of a great life cruelly ended. What that language, very carefully, was not then or at any point in the decades since, was political. The monarchy holds itself above politics. Therefore, the murder of one of its own had to be an act of pure, motiveless barbarism, arriving from nowhere and meaning nothing. The grief was real. Let me be absolutely clear about that. But grief was also the safest available story. The moment you concede the killing was political, questions start forming a queue. Why him? Why was the threat file ignored for 8 years? Who signed off on that security? What exactly had two governments known? Tragedy asks only for sympathy. Politics demands answers. The private track was fury, and it ran straight through Downing Street. Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister for under 4 months. The INLA had killed her closest advisor on the eve of her election. Now she had a murdered royal and 18 dead soldiers in one afternoon. Within 48 hours, she was in Northern Ireland, in an army beret, visiting troops near the border and the wounded in hospital, signaling in person that the new government did not intend to absorb any of this with quiet dignity. People forget how new she was that August. The iron reputation didn't exist yet. A good deal of it was forged in those weeks. Her instinct was that the entire security apparatus, on both sides of the border, had been caught asleep, and her response was to start banging heads together at the highest level available. London's demands landed on Dublin within days: tighter border security, real intelligence sharing, movement on extradition, the rawest nerve in Anglo-Irish relations, since IRA suspects could and did treat the border as a finish line. On the day of the funeral itself, Thatcher sat down in London with the Irish, Taoiseach Jack Lynch, and by every act, the meeting resembled a bill of particulars far more than a condolence call. Lynch was in an impossible position. Cooperate too little and London brands your state a haven for murderers. Cooperate too much, and your own party brands you a West Brit running errands for the English. He gave ground, including arrangements allowing British aircraft a corridor along the border, and when that concession leaked at home, it went down extremely badly indeed. Lynch's authority never recovered. Within weeks, his party had lost 2 by-elections in his own home county. Within months, he had lost his parliamentary party, and in December 1979, he resigned. He was succeeded by Charles Haughey, a man who had once stood trial over the alleged running of arms to Northern Republicans and been acquitted. The murder at Mullaghmore had helped remove one Irish prime minister and install another, which is a reasonable working definition of a political event. In October, Thatcher made her structural move, bringing Sir Maurice Oldfield, the recently retired chief of MI6, out of retirement to coordinate security and intelligence in Northern Ireland. The spymaster's appointment opened a colder, more intelligence-led phase of the whole conflict. So followed the chain of consequences. One bomb in a harbour, and inside 4 months you have a transformed British security policy, a new intelligence supremo, a full diplomatic crisis, and a change of government in Dublin. Files moved. Budgets moved, prime ministers moved. That is the wake of an assassination, and everyone at the top understood it perfectly, whatever vocabulary the palace press office was using. A month after the bomb, Pope John Paul II stood before more than 250,000 people at Drogheda, a few miles from the border, and made the most personal appeal of his young papacy, begging on his knees for an end to the violence. The IRA considered the request and published a refusal, restating its position that force alone would remove Britain from Ireland. Even the Pope, in the autumn of 1979, received his answer in the form of a position paper, and on the 5th of September, Westminster Abbey staged the funeral. Or rather, it staged Mountbatten's final production, because he had been drafting the event in detail for the better part of 20 years. The naval gun carriage drawn by more than 100 sailors, marching contingents from every service, and half a dozen countries. The hymns he had chosen, the 2,000 guests he had approved, and his charger, Dolly, walking behind the coffin with her master's boots reversed in the stirrups, every element specified by the deceased. He had spent 2 decades on the seating plan, and the abbey was full. One can only assume that somewhere the seating was being checked. It was also, quite deliberately, a show of defiance. The entire royal family, the leaders of the world, full imperial pageantry broadcast everywhere, 10 days after the IRA had killed him precisely because of what that pageantry stood for. The state was answering a political message with a political message. Nobody used those words, nobody needed to. 2 mourners were missing, and their absence said more than the trumpets. Patricia and John Brabourne were still in hospital, too gravely injured to bury their own son or her father or his mother. They followed the funerals of their family on television from adjoining hospital beds. In the front pews sat a 30-year-old Prince of Wales, holding himself together by visible effort. Charles read the lesson, the psalm, about those who go down to the sea in ships and see the works of the Lord in the deep. Into his journal he poured the rest, a wretched, disbelieving grief for the man he had called his honorary grandfather, and alongside it a hard, cold anger at the men responsible which, those close to him say, took decades to loosen its grip. Mountbatten was the one person on earth who told Charles the truth to his face, and only months earlier he had used that privilege to deliver the harshest letter of the prince's life. You can count the people who ever spoke to the heir like that on one hand. After Sligo, the count stood at 0, and I'd argue the family felt the loss of that honesty for the next 40 years. There was one more private casualty. Within weeks, Charles proposed to Amanda Knatchbull. The granddaughter Dickie had spent a decade steering toward him. She refused him. By most accounts, the bomb itself had settled the question, because it had just shown her with perfect clarity what proximity to that family could cost. It had killed her grandfather, her grandmother, and her 14-year-old brother on a fishing trip. So the matchmaker's last fix died with him, declined by the one person with the best possible reasons. And you can draw a straight line from that refusal. Within 2 years, a 19-year-old called Diana Spencer is standing on the steps of St. Paul's. Without Mullaghmore, the whole modern story of this royal family may run down an entirely different channel. The bomb ended 4 lives and rerouted an institution. In November 1979, in the non-jury Special Criminal Court in Dublin, the state presented its case against the 2 men from the Grenard checkpoint. Against Thomas McMahon, the evidence was forensic and damning. Traces of nitroglycerine on his clothing. On his boots, flakes of green paint matching the hull of Shadow V, and sand matching the slip where she had lain. The boat had marked the man who mined her. McMahon was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Francis McGurl was acquitted, the court allowing him the benefit of the doubt, though the trial heard an account that in custody, before news of the attack had broken anywhere, he had blurted out a denial about putting a bomb on a boat that nobody present had yet mentioned. He walked free, went home, and died in an accident in 1995. The men on the headland with the transmitter were never identified, never charged, and at this distance never will be. One conviction. That is the entire judicial outcome for 4 murders planned and executed by a unit of several people. The state proved who built the device. It never so much as named who pressed the button. Then came the ending that settled the argument of this entire film, and it arrived 19 years later with 2 government signatures on it. In August 1998, under the early release provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, Thomas McMahon walked out of prison a free man. The agreement's release scheme existed for one category of prisoner, and one only: those whose offenses were connected to the political conflict. Sit with that for a moment. The British and Irish states, by international treaty, process the murder of Lord Mountbatten as a political offence and release the man convicted of it on precisely that basis. The palace's vocabulary had said tragedy for 20 years. The paperwork of 2 sovereign governments eventually said politics, in black and white, with signatures and a date. The other paperwork took even longer to surface. Over the following decades, releases of state files in Dublin and London confirmed what the commentators of 1979 could only hint at. The threat to Mountbatten had been assessed, documented, and discussed at official level for the better part of a decade before the attack. The gaps in his protection had been known, raised and left open, partly at the great man's own insistence. Nobody resigned over any of it. No public inquiry ever picked through it. The palace, for its part, asked no questions out loud, and some material stayed closed for so long that researchers had to fight for it file by file. And you can see exactly why every institution preferred the silence. For London, an honest reckoning meant admitting a catastrophic protection failure around a member of the royal family. For Dublin, it meant a sovereignty row about who polices the Irish coast. For the palace, it meant conceding that one of its own had been a political target, selected for political reasons, which collides head-on with the founding myth that the family floats above politics altogether. Silence suited absolutely everyone, except, you might argue, the record. And there is one final irony, the sharpest of the lot. The man they killed as the symbol of British rule had spent his entire life being more political than the institution ever admitted, scheming, lobbying, matchmaking, fielding coup proposals over tea, and he may privately have believed a united Ireland was coming regardless. They executed a symbol. This symbol, being Dickie, had opinions of his own, and history was denied the pleasure of hearing them. What the silence of governments could not manage, individual people eventually did. Mullaghmore grieved like a bereaved family, because in part that is what it was. Local men had pulled people they knew from their own harbour, and the village carried the association for years the way a house carries a fire. In Enniskillen, Paul Maxwell's parents had lost a 15-year-old son to a war he had no part in, a boy whose summer job was the envy of his friends. His mother would say in time that she had found her way to forgiveness, which is a sentence easier to type than to live. Timothy Knatchbull, the surviving twin, came back. He returned in adulthood, walked the harbour, sat in the kitchens of the people who had pulled his family from the water, and in 2009 published an account of the bombing and of his own long road toward forgiving the men who killed his brother. His mother, Patricia, who carried the scars of that morning on her face for the rest of her life, spoke of Ireland without a trace of bitterness, and said the kindness of the people of Sligo had never been forgotten by any of them. The family's grace about Ireland, given what happened to them in Ireland, is one of the most striking things in this entire story. They never once blamed the place. They kept saying, in effect, this was done to us and to Mullaghmore at the same time, and the village agreed with them. Then, at long last, the institutions caught up with the people. In May 2011, Queen Elizabeth made the first state visit to the Irish Republic by a reigning British monarch in a century. She laid a wreath in the Garden of Remembrance, honoring the men and women who died fighting British rule, and bowed her head before their memorial. She opened her Dublin Castle speech in the Irish language to an audible gasp and spoke of a troubled past, of things that should have been done differently or not at all. Veterans of Anglo-Irish relations watched 100 years of frost crack over the course of 4 days. People forget what that visit cost her in private. The IRA had murdered her husband's uncle, her son's beloved mentor, 2 children in the same little boat, and there she stood, honoring Ireland's patriot dead with a bowed head. If Mullaghmore was a political act, so magnificently was that. In 2015 came the harder handshake. Prince Charles in Galway took the hand of Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, in front of the cameras of the world. Days later, he stood at Mullaghmore harbour itself, looked out at the stretch of water where Shadow Fee had been, and spoke of what the loss had done to him, and of how it had eventually taught him to understand the suffering carried by families on every side of the conflict, whatever their tradition. He met the people who had rowed out that morning in 1979, and he said he wished the place of his family's deepest pain might stand from now on for healing. I was in the village that day. People who had stood on that harbour wall as the smoke cleared in 1979 stood there again, older now, watching the dead man's heir shake hands with living republicanism. Nobody pretended any of it was simple. But it happened here, where it started, and to the people of this place that mattered more than any communique ever could. Shadow V was never replaced. The castle passed out of the family's hands. The harbour looks much as it always did. Small boats, grey water, gulls, and the headland above, where men once stood with a transmitter and were never named. Strip away 47 years of careful official language, and the record is plain. A target chosen for what he symbolized, a communique explaining the choice on the day itself, a security failure documented in advance and buried afterwards, a diplomatic crisis, a fallen Taoiseach, a transformed security policy, and a convicted man released under a peace treaty as a political prisoner. Every entry on that list is political. Only the official adjective never was, and the closing joke is one Dickie himself might have savored because it concerns his own importance, his favorite subject. He spent 8 decades trying to steer history, usually from a position just behind the throne, and history granted him more influence in death than the establishment ever admitted he had in life. One August morning in Sligo changed 2 governments, hardened a prime minister, rerouted a royal marriage, and decades later drew from a queen and a prince their greatest gestures of peace. He always demanded to be at the center of events. He has never once left it. The palace called it a tragedy, and for 4 families on that boat, that is exactly and forever what it was. The men who planned it called it politics, and the slow paperwork of 2 states came, in the end, to agree with them on that single point and on nothing else. Lord Mountbatten was murdered for what he represented, by people who said so in writing, with consequences that redrew the affairs of 2 islands. The royal family has never spoken that sentence aloud. By now it no longer has to. History has been saying it for them all along.